Well, I think we could get started now. I know there'll be a few people coming in a little later, but I want to welcome all of you to the second of our Spring from the Kislak Stacks Zoom events. I'm so pleased that my colleague Mitch Fraas, the Director of Special Collections and Research Services, will be speaking today on regulating the poor, ephemeral printing and poor relief tickets in the long 19th century. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that on April 22nd, Friday at noon, our director, Sean Quimby, will be speaking on Orrin Evans and All Negro Comics. So you're all welcome to attend. That will be the third and last of the From the Kislak Stacks for the spring semester. We will start them up again in the fall. At this point, I'd like to welcome Mitch to present on regulating the poor. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks everyone for joining. I know there's it was fun to see in the chat and participants who's here. Welcome everyone. Be nice to do this in person, but it's also kind of fun. I'm realizing with this particular presentation, people would have had to really strain their eyes to see just about anything in person on these tickets. So you get the advantage of having the online presence at a enhanced scale. The talk today, is part of our series of Kislak Curators talks, and I've really enjoyed them so far. I hope people will come to the rest of them this semester. And one of their aims is to sort of take items in our collection, contextualize them, talk about why they are exciting. And for that reason, I've picked a sort of area of the collection that I care about and I think is interesting for people, and also that I think is illustrative of what you can do with some of these material objects in collections, not just at Penn, but everywhere. So to begin, I've always thought it's odd that the expression, getting one's meal ticket remains somewhat common, at least in American English in the 21st century, especially as its use is rarely linked to actual relief for those experiencing food insecurity. It removes the metaphor from the everyday world of meal tickets themselves. Today, you could say that there are at least 20 million meal tickets in the United States in the form of SNAP EBT debit cards, themselves a successor to what were called food stamps. The expression of sort of meal ticket to mean to get one's meal ticket to have a free ride is traced by the OED to the American Civil War and the use by charity organizations of tickets for relief for soldiers who are convalescing, which removes it, I think, a bit from the context that I'm talking about today, but remains relevant in the two different meetings that I'll be talking about when we talk about meal or charity tickets. I'll be talking today about the physical manifestations of these meal tickets in our collection here at Penn and elsewhere. Thanks to decades of collecting by my colleagues, predecessors, and I have all built an array of material relating to the early history of poor relief, charity, and ground level social movements in the British Isles and to some extent in America. Some of this collecting is related to our interests in the history of cookery and food, championed by my colleague Lynn Farrington, who introduced me, who's been doing this for many years now. Others are tied here to older interest at Penn in social history, demography, industrial organization in the British Isles, and some I've acquired myself over the last 10 years or so. The literature on the history of charity and food relief is truly vast. I don't know if anyone on the meeting here today is in that field, but it's really a robust field of study with articles, books galore, and I can't claim any special expertise. One of the joys of being a librarian is sparking interest in materials by others based on our knowledge of what these material traces of the past can tell us, what is common, what is uncommon, what is extraordinary, and how they might be deployed in further research. I'll start then with a close look at one piece of food relief ephemera in our collection here at Penn, and then examine this one item in a larger contextual picture. On the screen here, which I sure hope is on the screen here, you'll see a piece from our collection, which I acquired in 2016 from Connor Pattenden, a London-based ephemera dealer. It measures 11 by 15 centimeters, or about the size of this sticky note thing I'm holding up next to my face for scale. I'm not attempting to wave the original in front of the camera. As one of the things you'll notice if you touch it is its poor quality, soft and friable paper. And I thought for sure if I tried holding it up, I'd end up ripping it in two and embarrassing everyone. In addition, you'll notice on this ticket rows of perforations running vertically and horizontally across the item. These separate out sort of 4 distinct tickets, each with identical text. A few things first. On their face, these tickets promise the bearer, quote, 1 meal consisting of soup, meat, vegetables, and bread, but mind you, in his own jug and basin. This is all at an establishment called the Middlesex Soup and Dinner Kitchen in London, though of course, London is not mentioned, just the local address. This is obviously not for use by people outside of the vicinity. In addition, the bearer of the ticket is informed that this is only valid and can only be redeemed between noon and 2 p.m. Tuesdays through Saturday, and that it is valid for only a 5-month period between October and March 1899 to 1900. There is a number 30 that you can see stamped separately on each of the tickets in the upper left-hand corner. Given the different alignment and registration of these numbers on the 4 tickets, I'm guessing the primary ticket was printed before this auto-stamped number. This block of tickets has not been separated, but wasn't clearly intended to have been separated by the bearer and handed in. Importantly, for what I'll be talking about, there are no blanks on these tickets. There's no space for amendation, notation, crossing out, the naming of people, etc. It's merely a bearer instrument, whoever has it. In the conventional narrative of food relief, and I'll keep this ticket up for a little while and then return to it, repeated in most general monographs. For an example, you could see Tom Scott Smith's On an Empty Stomach, published by Cornell last year. And I'll have a little bit of a bibliography at the end, so you don't have to write down names or anything. In this sort of conventional narrative, there's a flow from a sort of paternalist, community-based system of charity to a technified, industrial, and impersonal apparatus at modern scale, supported by large and national charities, state institutions, providing relief to thousands or millions. Meal tickets like the one I've just have on the screen here help us trace that transformation from a sort of more local, community-based charitable system to that larger impersonal one. However, I think looking at the material objects themselves help complicate that story and don't always adhere as closely to this narrative. And I think are really fruitful sources for further study and offer scholars of charity, food relief, et cetera, a new kind of source than the usual administrative minutes or reports. As I mentioned before, the history of poor relief goes back millennia, has complex histories in different parts of the world. There's robust soup kitchen histories for the Ottoman Empire, for China, et cetera. It feels a little weird to glibly skip over all this to 18th century England, but it's been done before. And I'm talking mostly about sort of the long 19th century in the British Isles. By the mid to late 18th century, with the increase in mobility geographically across England and in terms of labor and the sheer growing population, the sort of parish-based poor law apparatus in England had strained to the breaking point. You know, anchoring everything in the local parish is all fine and good when those are finite units, but when people start moving around and congregating in ever larger numbers in places like London, the system really breaks down. By this point in the mid to late 18th century, a whole variety of reformers and politicians began to put forward different schemes for providing food relief to the needy. Many of these ideas relied on the basic premises of the older system. Well-off patrons or institutions would support institutions like hospitals, soup kitchens, and orphanages, and as part of their patronage would have the ability to dictate who the worthy poor were and who could take advantage of these services. Well, in earlier periods, this kind of recommendation and patronage might take the form of word of mouth or handwritten slips. By the 18th century, the scale and need of population growth brought the world of print more intensely into this process. In her incisive study of the rise of printed tickets for all sorts of purposes in 18th century London, it's a great article by Sarah Lloyd. She makes the case that printed tickets became ubiquitous across social classes and helped mediate social relations in a more impersonal growing metropolis. One particular area of growth, I think, was in charity tickets of all sorts of different forms. Usually these were printed rather than handwritten for a charitable society for patrons to write in the names of those they thought worthy, or in some cases distributed as bearer instruments like the one you saw that just are usable by anyone. Lloyd writes of charity tickets as they took on new meanings in the 18th century. She says, quote, "For the philanthropic, the ticket was a means to control resources, store up rewards, and instill a sense of responsibility in the poor." Yet conflict could, of course, arise between older worlds of patronage and this new one of transactional print. She notes in particular the Magdalen Hospital in London had a particular problem and was, quote, "ever on alert for inappropriate behavior and reserved the right to exclude all who they judged improper, whether or not they had managed to secure a printed ticket of admission." So you could see the sort of double system there. While we have no 18th century meal tickets at Penn, as far as I know of, I would love to know of one if people have seen one, we do have a very important early Philadelphia charity ticket that fits this model. On the screen here is a printed recommendation ticket for the Philadelphia dispensary issued in 1797. While surely hundreds, thousands were printed or issued blank to subscribers, this is one of only two that survive. This Philadelphia, do you sort of call it like anachronistically a charity clinic of sorts, allowed men of means who were subscribers and paid for the charity to issue tickets for deserving poor patients to receive care there. The ticket here is signed by University of Pennsylvania trustee and noted jurist Benjamin Chew Jr., and it allows a man named Garrett Cumwood to receive care. He's a man who I cannot trace in any of the early federal censuses and was almost certainly on the down and out. This ticket gives pride of place to the philanthropic contributor, Benjamin Chew in this case, who signs as a kind of surety that the named person is worthy of charity. The ticket is not transferable, it's just for the man named, and the majority of its text consists of rules to be followed and caveats on care, lots of rules there of proper behavior. There's also a rule that says basically, if you're not actually a proper object of charity and not really in need of care, they can refuse you even with the ticket. There were constant fears that people would secure tickets by faking. By the period in which this ticket was issued, there was already a swell of reforming notions which took aim at the free charity or meal ticket, instead to emphasize worthiness, self-uplift, and closer, more sort of, to use a modern term, like data-driven control over resources. These new putatively scientific proposals for feeding the poor often centered on incredible claims of particular recipes for a broth or a soup that would be particularly invigorating or nutritious, the advantages of certain large-scale cooking technologies, bigger and better mass vats for making soup, and new ideas about how to allocate relief. Especially important in the European context, reformers like Patrick Calhoun in London and Reichsgraf von Rumdorf, less impressively actually born Ben Thompson in Woburn, Massachusetts, promoted cheaper food instead of totally free food. That is, instead of giving out free tickets, the poor would have to pay at least a subsidized cost. Printed tickets were essential in these new sort of scientific soup kitchens. They were usually sold for a small amount or given in exchange for labor. Writing of the Rumford model for soup kitchens, Tom Scott Smith notes, quote, "To receive a meal, each person was required to work and their output was closely monitored. Standardized forms were used to record attendance and labor rates, with meal tickets distributed to those deserving of support." For Calhoun, the reformer in London, tickets occupy several paragraphs in his works on poor relief and are full of all manner of technical details. Though some Swiss soup kitchens, tongue twister, began to issue engraved tickets with Count Rumford's face on them around 1801, or so he bragged to his daughter. Like many reformers of the period, he was kind of an obnoxious and vain guy who loved bragging more about poor relief than cared about the poor. I've not been able to trace any of those tickets bearing his visage. Likewise, though I've not been able to trace a real life used or unused example of one of these London Calhoun tickets, he kindly printed a mocked up example in his 1799 treatise on feeding the poor, as you can see here. And yes, it took meeting someone in Scotland to stop pronouncing his name as Patrick Colquhoun, which I did for a while, so it's Patrick Calhoun. You can see the blank, which still survives in this kind of ticket for the patron and the recommender. But the mention of bad halfpence, which you see there, bad halfpence will be refused, makes clear that's sort of counterfeit small change. Makes clear that these tickets were given to the poor by recommenders and then redeemed with money for actual soup, not for free. The amount of soup to be allocated would also be written in by the examiner, number of courts there, who sat in a special booth to take tickets and payment before entrance to the soup line. Calhoun was a particular sort of architectural nut and designed soup kitchen, all the latest scientific lines. Here's his ground plan for his soup house. I've put an arrow towards the ticket takers station there that everyone would have to file past to give in their ticket and their money. Calhoun claimed that in just a few months in 1799, his charity gave out a whopping 181,276 tickets for subsidized beef soup and about 25,000 for subsidized potatoes. My assumption, although happy to be proved wrong, is that none of these 180,000 tickets survives today. While Calhoun and his London relief schemes are well known, you can find him cited left and right in the literature, we have here at Penn an important collection of a smaller provincial soup kitchen, the Amersham Soup Society, which distributed food to the poor in the small English town in the years around 1800. This is a fascinating collection acquired maybe 40 or 50 years ago here, and includes a sketch of the proposed kitchen on Calhoun's plan, as well as the printed rules of the society, as you can see here, and ledgers of expenses. This small society followed the subsidized ticket model, and patrons registered tickets in a ledger as they gave them out, specifying the amount of food a particular person or family should receive. And you could always go back and check the ledger that the person giving in the ticket matched who you thought they were. Though there are no copies of actual tickets in the collection we have here, we do know from their accounts that in January of 1800, they ordered 1,500 printed tickets for soup to serve a population in Amersham of about 2,000 people. You can see here I've highlighted one of the rules that specifically talks about the patrons of the subscribers to the society's role in taking tickets. And here's a bit from their account book giving their printing cost for their 1,500 tickets. Of interest, that amount they're paying for tickets there is about equal to what they paid for kettles to making the soup. So that sort of give a sense of the differential costs and what's important to them. We don't know much about the Soup Society after the records here at Penn, but I do not think it's survived much longer. Returning to our London tickets from the start of the presentation, one might assume that the anonymous bearer model of tickets, that is, no name written in, no way to sort of specify that this person is worthy, would have become dominant over the course of the 19th century as a sort of mass scale, industrialized, able to give relief to 100,000 to 1 million people. But I don't think this narrative is quite as clean as you'd think. Here I've reproduced two meal tickets. These are just two that I've been able to trace. One I purchased here from an eBay seller in the UK a few years ago. The other is from the Irish famine and was sent as evidence to a government commission. Both show the persistence of personal identification and specific allotted food portions in their meal tickets. The recipients in both cases are named and registered and recorded by a sort of commissioner or authority. In the case of the Drogheda ticket from Ireland to the left, relief commissioners handily gave a detailed explanation of the ticket and its materiality in their report. Quote, "I send you," to the commission, "one of our tickets for bread and soup rations. Parchment is selected in preference to paper, as the tickets remain in the possession of the poor persons and get rumpled and soiled in their keeping, circumstances which would be destructive to paper if they were to be issued to last 6 months. The committee man at the relief committee makes a puncture with a large awl on the date as we'll perceive on this example, March the 12th. And you can, in fact, see the hole punched through there. This prevents the return of the ticket for that day, whilst the ticket still remains good for the other days. The number 200, which you can see on the top there, refers to a corresponding number in the registry book in which the particulars are recorded. In this case, the number of people in the family and presumably the allocation of soup. Both of these tickets indicate clearly the relationship of dependence and power between the recipient and the food distributor. The Leicestershire ticket, for example, to the right, even presents the bearer, him or herself, with the possibilities not allowed by the committee or the distributor of aid. In this case, other amounts of food possibly allowed are crossed out by hand. Of course, some of these are smaller rations and less desirable, but there's at least one larger option crossed out, but of course still legible, so you know what you are not getting. In this case, probably based on family size, age, sex, etc. There is a obsession in the period with scientific or pseudoscientific calculations of the amount of food necessary for different people, different types of people by racial group, age, sex, etc., and a sort of rigorous obsession by charitable and government elites with making sure only the right amount of food is given and not too much. You can see this in two other pieces of ephemera from here at Penn. Neither of these are meal tickets per se. These are meal cards that I've bought in the last couple of years. They're stiff cardboard placards, which are meant for display. And they state the amount of food to be received by different categories of, in this case, prisoners from the Isle of Man in the 1890s to the left and the 1850s in Wiltshire to the right. These are highly specified amounts of food to be given to different types of prisoners based on a number of characteristics, also going into details of what's in the soup, the kinds of soup different people get, and the kinds of potatoes, etc. There's a lot of interest in sort of scientifically or pseudoscientifically specifying all of these categories precisely. I want to move on by returning to the Middlesex ticket, the one from London in the group of 4 that I started the talk with, and reflect a bit on the ephemerality or lack thereof of meal tickets and how this contributes to the narrative of poor relief. Tickets like the Middlesex one are truly rare, printed on cheap paper, unlike the parchment ones in the Irish case, in mass on a probably, here I'll return to, oops, there we go. Return to the ticket so you can take a look. Printed on mass, probably on a spool ticket printer like you might see at like an arcade or something, one of those giant reels of tickets that would have been printed on those reels. Those were invented and necessitated in the 1870s, 1880s, largely due to the rise of trams and other mass transportation, which required an ever greater number of physical proofs of payment, and to print and distribute tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of those in the metropolises of the 19th century led people to invent that spool ticket printing method with the perforations. I suspect that it's no coincidence that this block of tickets survives in a block. I can imagine, for example, that it was distributed as such, not as a single torn ticket, but as a block, whether a 4 or 8, or who knows what the original was, perhaps as a block of 4 meals in this case. I'm less sure on the number 30. It could be, of course, like we saw earlier, something to be matched up against a ledger to a particular person. I think more likely these are bearer tickets to be given out to anyone, and 30 is just a control number, so they know how many tickets they've distributed and how, rather than corresponding to a specific name. But you'll note that the number is the same across all 4 tickets, suggesting they were distributed together. I have no idea, by the way, how it survived or what its path to the London ephemera trade was. I think I have to ask the dealer, but it was not acquired. It's not like a part of a larger collection. My guess is a flea market somewhere, or perhaps tucked in the back of a book. Soup tickets and other hunger relief ephemera, specifically like this, is extremely uncommon. I have traced fewer than about 10 examples before 1900, one of which is the one you see here from Penn. Most of these survive not at all like the pen example. This one is loose and contextless now in a folder, and hopefully will survive. All the other ones I've traced, like the Irish example, are in the institutional records of charities or government agencies, either as exemplars, like pasted into the back of a charitable register as a sort of example of what they've done, or, and actually you can see this, there we go, or in printers files. This is a fun one. This is, you can see that all mark, that big hole in the middle. And then on the left, although written, I should have rotated the slide, it says 200, February 23rd, 1853. This comes from the printer's file of a printer. I know this because this particular printer has ephemera popping up all over the place, and I probably kept as an example. This was commissioned in 200 copies by the jail, and he probably spiked this on a nice spike and kept it with the rest of his exemplar printing, and that's how it has survived to today. In addition, actually, why have one example when you can have two? This one is not from a printer's file, but the Leicestershire example I used earlier has that nice, I don't know if Peter Salibras is on this, but he would enjoy he's really into files and awls. In this case, it's a filing stick like you'd see maybe in a deli now, where they slam the receipt on a nice spike. In this case, the ticket taker at the Leicestershire charity has almost certainly taken this ticket and spiked it. And then they probably bundled a whole months or weeks of tickets in twine for unknown record keeper purposes that they never actually used, only to surface 100 years later and to be sold. And in fact, you can still find occasionally, I've just bought another one. Whoever found these occasionally puts them up on eBay for different people. So I'm trying to get one that also illustrates a different quantity of food allocated to someone, perhaps who is not a man. They pop up once in a while. So someone clearly found this bundle of tickets. I'd like to contrast this kind of survival, which is incredibly rare, really ephemeral, with a different kind of meal ticket. The kind of meal ticket seen here. On the upper left is one of the first pieces related to poor relief that I saw here at Penn. This was acquired by my predecessor, Nancy Shawcross, in 2012 as part of the records of the orphan asylum at Lambeth, which we have here. This is a ticket tucked in the back of one of those record books. When I had thought about this before and starting this talk, I initially thought it was a meal ticket for the asylum itself, for one of the orphans. I don't believe that's the case any longer. On the bottom right is a finely engraved meal ticket on thick paper from one of the great ephemera collectors of all times, Sophia Banks, which is now at the British Museum. She probably collected as much ephemera, and I think there's someone who famously said this, as much ephemera as her brother Joseph Banks collected botanical specimens. These kinds of meal tickets survive in large numbers. I mean, they're not cheap or common by any means, but they're in most collections of ephemera. They're findable in many bookseller catalogs and auctions and many collections. What are they then? Why are these meal tickets different? These are, of course, social invitations. This is another page of Sophia Banks' collection. This is understandable. These can be found like here, pasted into a collector's album or saved with family papers as a memento. They are signs of status. They're beautiful works of engraving. There's some famous engravers who do this even. This is a page of 18th century dinner tickets. They are not the same kind of ephemera. In other words, they convey a kind of entitlement to a meal, but they're quite different. They delineate privilege and power, but in a kind of an inverse way to the earlier meal tickets. These are desirable signs of entitlement rather than possibly undesirable. They may also be printed on thick parchment, but for very different reasons. In this case, decorative, artistic, and status rather than longevity in the hands of the poor. In many cases, early reformers and poor relief advocates alike intended presence in a soup kitchen line or relief line as humiliating or something to be avoided, lest one get too used to it and not work. It was the great fear. Tickets at these soup kitchens would also be, collected or registered, spiked or thrown away. It's hard to imagine them being saved as souvenirs, except by some of the charities themselves and put in their records. Unused tickets were pretty unlikely to end up as cherished family heirlooms or collectibles of the time. This is, I think, an important distinction to make when we talk about ephemera and survival. As a coda, and to sort of close out my remarks, I'll make a quick mention of ration cards and tickets, which I mentioned in my blurb, but I'm only going to talk about here briefly. These, I think people are probably more familiar with. These certainly are signifiers of hardship. They are ubiquitous. If you go on eBay right now and you have $5, you can buy a World War II ration book, choose from hundreds of examples. They are everywhere, mostly US, but some Britain and European. They were distributed by the millions, and a lot of people kept them. These, of course, are signifiers of hardship, but often communal rather than individual suffering. They convey a kind of pride at national unity or fight for a cause, a moment in time to look back on, something to keep for your grandkids. They are not the same as a signifier of individual need handed out by a patron. And to sort of close this out, I'll leave you with an odd coincidence. This right here is one of my favorite sheets of ration cards. I think I bought this in 2016. This is a sheet of ration cards from the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. This was kept in a scrapbook. And by odd coincidence, the superintendent of the Middlesex soup kitchen of those 4 tickets was a woman named Anna Bardou, who herself escaped Paris for London after the Commune and was reputed to have set up soup kitchens for refugees from France. And she continued to do so for the rest of her life. She herself undoubtedly had used meal tickets or been given them of the sort present here on the scrapbook page from the Commune and the period of the siege. These particular ration cards were saved in a scrapbook by a proud communard, in this case, Anna Rothschild. And one wonders how Bardot's experience of wartime food relief colored her approach to tickets and the poor on her arrival in London. The kind of communal solidarity and shared sense of unity and passion that Anna Rothschild put into collecting her ration cards from the war and the Commune are very different than the kind of ephemera of individual need that I have talked about earlier. Thank you everyone for this. I think I've kept it to half an hour. I hope this has been a sort of interesting and illuminating look at how different kinds of material sources, including the most ephemeral, can illuminate some of the connections and contexts which you and your teaching or research can bear in mind when examining items in the collection. And sort of want to encourage people to be thinking of these connections and what they tell us about the standard narratives of a particular area, like food relief or the history of charity. And myself and curatorial colleagues are always on the lookout and building the collections here to ensure that researchers and students in the future are able to make these kind of connections and really rethink their relationship with the past. I'll leave you, as promised, with my bibliography slide there, and can open things up for questions.
Mitch, I have a question for you. For the various poor relief soup kitchens, it seems like most of them are delivering midday meals. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, that's at least in the literature, like the reformers themselves writing. And I don't know, Lynn, you'll probably know more than I do on this, but the pseudoscience at the time had a lot to say about timing of meals and nutritive properties of food. There was a big thing, Rumford, the soup kitchen guy, really championed watery food as the engine behind work, and work was the big emphasis. So, you want people to have that big meal in the middle of the day so they could continue working. End of the day is not going to do the supervisors at the factory much good.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, the idea, because there's a lot of things going on with the development of the restaurant and the idea of restorative broths and health and all of that kind of thing. And it's right at that same period in the late 18th century. So it's kind of interesting to think about that.
I see a question in the chat, I think. Okay, I'll read that. From John Edmund Beach, the point about the bearer tickets versus name blank tickets relates interestingly. Oh, yeah, here's something I should put in the bibliography. Fraser and Gordon's 1994 Genealogy of Dependence, which among other things hypothesizes individuation of dependency over time. You know, dependence as a kind of person, a flawed person, as a character trait. Yeah, as like a pathology rather than a temporary food insecurity. Yeah, and John wonders if we can see a reflection on this thesis in impersonal tickets granting a meal to the bearer versus forms filled in with a person's name. And now, of course, the modern US system of SNAP electronic benefit cards, which immediately and indefinitely identify their bearers as needy. Yeah, I think this is, I sort of started my remarks with SNAP because I think it is the sort of where meal tickets have come. And the real pinnacle, I think a lot of these 18th and 19th century reformers would have been overjoyed at the idea of that kind of granular tracking of the poor, deserved or otherwise, and that kind of surveillance that electronic technology could enable, and also recognize in them as individuated, tied to a particular name or a family or a person, a hedge against the dangers of sort of undeservingness, which is an obsession for 19th century reformers. There must be literature. I'd be curious with anthropologists or sociologists on the materiality of food benefits, in the era of actual food stamps and then the move to EBT and SNAP. Like one of the things that in the earlier sources, I would love to see more reflection from people who received these meal tickets on what they meant to them. Almost all the sources besides the materials themselves are from relatively elite sources. And I'm pretty sure now anthropologists and sociologists have done kind of work with contemporary receivers of food aid on how they conceptualize what this entitlement benefit, government aid means. The only example, I didn't put a slide of this in, but there's in the mid-19th century a couple of textbooks for use by reforming teachers who are teaching working class students in the US, which include in their lesson examples for teaching students. You have to, for young children, like this will be a lesson about thrift and money, and in the classroom you'll talk about coins, which they know about, and then you'll have to introduce them to the concept of paper money. This is super confusing. So analogize it with meal tickets. They will know meal tickets and just say paper money is like a meal ticket that can be used for a lot of different things. And this is a sort of brilliant, paper money is the ultimate bearer instrument. It's not a check, it's not, someone's name. And the recognition in these reforming teachers that all of their students will be familiar with the sort of bearer ticket to a meal is a fascinating one. I'd love someone to do more work on that.
Mitch, I just wanted to mention, I mean, one of the issues around, food aid, especially when, they were passing out tickets as opposed to this form, was that people were using it to buy a lot of unhealthy foods rather than buying the kinds of foods that they really needed to buy. And so there was a real issue around that, a critique within the government that, these people were just buying the wrong kinds of things. They were buying lots of soda and chips and not healthy food. So I think it's interesting to think about that as well. I mean, versus giving somebody something that, is viewed as healthy.
Yeah, that obsession goes back, in terms of, the social reform project of sort of surveillance and reform that is not just giving food relief, but changing people's diet. I think, and especially in the Irish cases, there's enough blame the poor going around in reforming circles about what people are supposed to be eating and what they should be eating. And one of the aims of, I think, the early soup kitchens was to standardize diet. It's to say, we know best. Basically, we will put a bunch of meat drippings and the language in these early 19th, late 18th century pamphlets on soup kitchens are great. They're totally worth reading. Lots of talks about nutritive vegetation and water with meat drippings and theories of heat. So as opposed to whatever people were eating improperly or beer or whatever. And I'm seeing in the chat, I did not know that unlike SNAP, that WIC benefits the women, infant, and children food vouchers remain printed paper vouchers with individualized list of food items. That's really interesting. There's actually there's a history of food stamps and food relief website on the Health and Human Services government website. Lots of text. I would love more visual examples over the years, but it's a helpful sort of summary of the history of government provided food relief in the US. Happy to take questions directly too, if people want to speak.
Mitch, David here.
Yeah.
I'll turn on my video too. It looked like some of the examples that you had were of wealthy individuals distributing aid, food aid. Do you have a sense of, was there a point in time, at least in this country, where it transitioned from that kind of individual benefactor to more of a government funded and operated kind of food assistance program? Yeah,
I mean, this is where I get out of my depth. Seeing if my friend who is a relief historian is on the call, and he's not, so I can now say things without worrying about being called out on being wrong. But yeah, I mean, there's a clear transition, and part of the history, I think, of the progressive era is like that decisive transition towards larger state intervention rather than depending on individual people. I mean, obviously the transition happens earlier, but the sort of more complete turn to the state, I think, is a late 19th, early 20th century progressive era thing. And things like the certificate that's up here, which is from Benjamin Chew, which is a great example of sort of individualized relief, is a good one. Although I think, into anytime you try to determine worthiness, even government agencies then are sort of playing the role of patron, of saying, we need a letter from your employer or your church or something to prove that you actually live at this address, or that you have 2 children, or that you are worthy of this aid, still persists. And though it's not like a wealthy patron, it's then someone in the bureaucracy who becomes the sort of gatekeeper. I'm pretty sure we only have this this particular piece of ephemera because it's related to Penn's history, in that it's a signature piece. It survives, I think, because of Benjamin Chew's autograph on it, and he was a trustee of the early university. Oh, Sarah Lloyd is on the, wow. Yeah, I mean, obviously, sorry, there's only so much I can say about this stuff. This is fantastic. As I said earlier, her article on 18th century ticketing is absolutely amazing. So our history in collecting this stuff is, I think, multivarious. There was an interest in the 60s, 70s, et cetera, in sort of social history from the ground up, and demography, history of societies. And the Amersham Soup Society material arrived here then. My predecessor, Nancy Shawcross, was interested in, and Lynn as well, in sort of social history from below, and combined with that and Lynn's interest in food history, a lot of our cookery collection was developed, and things like the minutes of the asylum for orphan girls at Lambeth were purchased as part of that. Most of the actual tickets here, like the one I'm showing here, the Benjamin Chew one, I'm pretty sure it's been here for a long time, and I think it was an autograph value kind of thing. Most of the other things I've purchased in the last couple of years, just out of an interest in adding different kinds of sources to our charity and poor relief collection. The other big sort of category of source we have are publications of charities themselves, like, you know, as you know, like every single small town and village had its own sort of relief society, and we have a lot of these small pamphlets that are like, you know, a list of bequests and obligations of the, you know, Twickenham Society for the Relief of Paupers or something. So there's a large number of those that we've also been buying, but I got interested in things that were much more ephemeral and didn't come through the hands of sort of patrons or societies themselves. So most of these actual tickets, like that Isle of the Man thing, I think I just purchased last year, but most of those have come in the last 5 or 6 years or so. But the larger collections are much older. This ration, I didn't actually realize how interesting this was till after we got it. And I wish I knew where the rest of the scrapbook was that this came out of. But I thought it was just a, you know, exemplar of printed ephemera from the Paris Commune. But because we have Anna Rothschild's name on it, turns out she was not only a communard, but she actually worked in the canteen, the kitchens, and provided food in the Paris Commune, and was photographed along with other women prisoners after the collapse of the Commune. So we know a little bit about her, but not much. She was sentenced to deportation. I can't figure out what happened to her after that, but I'm sure a French historian might be able to. Also interesting for photographic historians there. On the right is the studio picture of her. On the left is a little snippet from a giant panorama of women communards imprisoned, which is a composite photograph. So a whole bunch of studio portraits were taken and sort of cut and pasted and rephotographed into a fake melange. They've edited out the chair on her back. That's why she's leaning at such a weird posture.
Well, if there are no additional questions, I think we'll let Mitch go and have his lunch. But thank you to everybody. John's got his hand up.
Oh, I could throw in one other thing. Sorry, before we run out the clock. And I apologize if this has been asked and answered, Mitch, because I had to step out for 10 minutes. So cut me off if so. But thank you. This is great. Really enjoyed this. And just a beautiful lesson of how you can take small objects and tell big stories. So that is wonderful. I was actually going to ask on this question that was central to your talk about sort of the individualized versus the collective in terms of these tickets, about if you can imagine not to take the top-down view, but what role they might have played in the patron's life, if any, if you can conceive of it. You know, did Benjamin Chew ever see who bore his tickets, and were they part of the reporting process in some ways?
So actually that I was going to plead ignorance and not pretend there, but actually in the Benjamin Chew example, the dispensary did collect, and there's I think one of the rules or stipulations in there is something like you must turn in this ticket and it'll be reported back to the patron. And if you don't do that, if you like keep it for later, if you go to the dispensary, you get treatment and then take it back with you and use it a year later, you will be like banned. You know, you have to turn in the ticket. They'll be reported back to your patron. I'm sure it was true in some other scenarios as well. But yeah, I think that's in a lot of these, the surveillance one is important. That Irish famine example, interestingly enough, the commissioners report back that they keep everything in ledger books. You know, they record the numbers, but they say we rarely have to make recourse to it, suggesting that, you know, they're not actually going back and looking to make sure that someone who has ticket 316 is actually John Smith, who was given ticket 316.
Yeah, so there's a story about bureaucracy here, and it's kind of self-perpetuation, and whether in addition to surveillance, I guess. Thank you.
I was just going to say, on the Amersham Soup Society, the people who are giving money are also the people who are actually doing the work, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it's actually, you know, they know who's coming through because they're the people who are actually giving the money and doing the work to make
and
sure
ladling the soup. Yeah.
I mean, they are they're ladling out the soup. They're making sure it's made. I mean, there's this whole, list of who has to come in when they're required to be there. And they are the people who are contributing. So it's an interesting case. I think they were all Quakers, if I'm right.
Yeah, I think that's right, or at least they were originally. Also, yeah, interestingly, it still relies so much on personal knowledge. Like they specify, like, I know that they pick the number of quarts of soup or whatever based on what their knowledge of the family or the person. And I think that's when you get to bearer tickets where you lose that personal touch. But I would encourage everyone, and this is a pitch for Professor Lloyd's article. It talks about not just charity tickets, but a whole range, entertainment tickets. I had never heard of Wesleyan Methodist tickets before in the 18th century. It's a great piece. So anyway, thanks everyone for coming.